Story time. A Wrinkle in Time. What is it that I have got that it hasn't got? You have nothing that it hasn't got, Charles Wallace said coldly. How nice to have you back, dear sister. We have been waiting for you. We knew that Mrs. Whatsit would send you. She is our friend, you know. For an appalling moment, Meg believed, and in that moment she felt her brain being gathered up into it. No, she screamed at the top of her lungs. No, you're lying about that. And you were lying about Mrs. Whatsit, she screamed. Mrs. Whatsit hates you, Charles Wallace said. And that was where it made its fatal mistake. For as Meg said automatically, Mrs. Whatsit loves me. That's what she told me, that she loves me. Suddenly she knew. She knew. Love. That was what she had that it did not have. But how could she use it? What was she meant to do? If she could give love to it, perhaps it would shrivel up and die. Perhaps it was not too much to ask of her, but she could not do it. But she could love Charles Wallace, her own Charles Wallace, the real Charles Wallace, the child for whom she had come back to Camazotz. She could love Charles Wallace. Charles, I love you, my baby brother who always takes care of me. Come back to me, Charles. Come away from it. Come back. Come home. I love you, Charles. Oh, Charles Wallace, I love you. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was unaware of them. She was now even able to look at him, at this animated thing that was not her own Charles Wallace at all. She was able to look and love. I love you, Charles Wallace. You are my darling and my dear and the light of my life and the treasure of my heart. I love you. I love you. I love you. Slowly his mouth closed. Slowly his eyes stopped their twirling. The tick in the forehead ceased its revolting twitch. Slowly he advanced towards her. I love you, she cried. I love you, Charles. I love you. Then suddenly he was running, pelting. He was in her arms. He was shrieking with sobs. Meg! 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 I love you, Charles, she cried again, her sobs almost as loud as his, her tears mingling with his. I love you. I love you. I love you. A whirl of darkness, an icy cold blast, an angry, resentful howl that seemed to tear through her. Darkness again. Through the darkness, to save her, came a sense of Mrs. Whatsit's presence, so that she knew it could not be it who now had her in its clutches. And then the feel of earth beneath her, of something in her arms, and she was rolling over on the sweet-smelling autumnal earth, and Charles Wallace was crying out, Meg! Oh, Meg! Now she was hugging him close to her, and his little arms were clasped tightly about her neck. Meg, you saved me! You saved me! He said over and over. Meg, you did it! Calvin shouted. You saved Charles! I'm very proud of you, my daughter, Mr. Murray kissed her gravely. Meg knew all at once that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which must be near, because all through her she felt a flooding of joy and of love that was even greater and deeper than the joy and love which were already there. She stopped laughing and listened, and Charles listened too. Hush. Then there was a whirring, and Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which were standing in front of them, and the joy and the love were so tangible that Meg felt that if only she knew where to reach, she could touch it with her bare hands. And Mrs. Whatsit said breathlessly, Oh, my darlings, I'm so sorry we don't have time to say goodbye to you properly. You see, we have to... But they never learned what it was that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which had to do, for there was a gust of wind, and they were gone.